Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on the Future of Voting. I am Lee Bollinger. I have the privilege of serving as co-chair of the committee along with Michael McRobey. As mentioned yesterday, the committee's task is to assess voting in America today and to offer a vision of voting that is easier, accessible, reliable, and verifiable. Today, we will be in open session until 12 noon. As noted yesterday, all open sessions are on the record. Materials that are provided to the committee by external sources will be deposited into a public access file where they are available to the public. Once the committee has deliberated thoroughly, it will draft its report and submit it for external review. Upon satisfying the Academy's requirements, the report will receive institutional approval to be issued as a report of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. At this time, I would like to invite Mr. Perez from Hart Unisyn to brief the committee. Mr. Perez.
Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's great to be with you all, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'm the Director of Product Management for Hart Unisyn, and my intent with my presentation is really, again, I will be brief, and I want to just lay a lot of issues on the table, and we've had a really good discussion yesterday as well. Before I really quickly even tee up my agenda, what I have on the slide behind me is really the most important thing that I hope we will at least start to illustrate today and that will emerge once we talk. And that is simply, I think from our perspective, the narrative of what the state of technology looks like among the practice of elections. From where we sit, it is different, and I think that it's very, very important, and I hope we can show that there is new technology that is available in the marketplace. And meetings like this and the conversations that are going on in many other forums illustrate just how much has really changed in the 15 years since HAVA. 15 years is a long time. There has been a remarkable amount of research and learning and information sharing that has really advanced the state of how people think about election technology and elections more generally. The pace is slow. It is absolutely slow. If nothing else, I hope I can also today, particularly under the topic of certification, shed a little bit of light in terms of the complexities that are there and why things are so slow. It is an exceedingly complex environment that, in my experience, one of the things that is always most striking is just how opaque a lot of the most fundamental and consequential things that really shape the flow of technology, how opaque that is to even the most savvy people that are really, really paying close attention, because it's difficult. But the change is there, so I hope that we can get into that. I will just say very, very briefly a few words about Hart Unisyn. I think the most important thing that I want to mention as far as the state of the state, as it were, is I do think things are very much at a kind of pivot point in terms of modernization. That is something that Hart has tried to take really, really seriously in terms of how we've thought about and designed our technology. As I said, I'll talk a little bit about certification. I'll try to highlight the challenges that I think these changes have made, and I do want to offer just a few recommendations. So very, very briefly, Hart is located in Austin, Texas. We have been around since 1912. All the way those many, many decades ago, Hart was originally a services company in elections, and it was really through ballot printing on wagons and that sort of thing, taking ballots to customers, that we got into elections. But we are today a major provider of election technology. We have our own proprietary systems. We currently have two systems that are out in the marketplace. We have a legacy system that is simply called the Hart Voting System. And the one that I'm going to focus on more today, because it is completely new, since 2015, is a system that is called Verity. And there's a lot of choice in terms of those systems and what they offer to our end users. So we try to be very comprehensive. We have options for traditional paper ballots. We have options for by-mail voting. We have options for electronic voting. We have all of the election management software end-to-end that puts it all under one umbrella. And again, our newest system, although it is new in 2015, it is being adopted, and there's a level of maturity there already. It's in 10 states. We've already had good, successful experience with multiple federal certifications of the EAC. So that's just a quick background and a level set. And I will also add, by the way, that in addition to all of that technology, we do, of course, provide services to our customers as well. We have a very, very wide range of jurisdictions, from the very smallest to the very largest. One of the things that we try to take very, very seriously is we simply want to provide the level of service and support that a customer wants. So we have people that really rely on Hart to help them to program their ballots, for example. We have other people that are absolutely at the totally self-sufficient end of the spectrum, and we believe in teaching people how to use the system and empower them wherever they want to fall on that spectrum. That's how we like to operate. So what do we think is most important in terms of the state of the state, the current state of play, as it was said in some of the memos for this meeting? So make no mistake, jurisdictions across the country are absolutely refreshing their technology. Although I think the easiest way to think about it is, as I noted, it's been 15 years since HAVA. Voting systems, and particularly something on that comprehensive platform for a lot of jurisdictions, if you just think of it at the level of sort of a procurement and an RFP, for a lot of people that's a major capital expenditure. It's a 10-year sort of timeline. And so we're roughly, with some exceptions, within about a decade of that, and I think that's what's driving a lot of counties and other jurisdictions that are looking to change their voting system for the first time since the big wave around HAVA. I think some of the most important things that have happened in that 10 or 15 years is, and a lot of them have been talked about yesterday as well, there is an unmistakable increased focus on voter services. There's been a lot of innovation in terms of how people think about running elections, all the topics that have already been talked about, new modes of voting, like election day vote centers, an increased focus on convenience voting. Early voting has become extremely important in many, many places. And I would say just in general, trying to increase the amount of outreach that goes to voters and to educate them about how they can participate in the process is something that we observe and have heard about in the last decade quite a bit. I also think it's really important that in that 10 years, election administrators have had many, many opportunities to really step up their level of professionalization and the level of institutional learning. They are also taking advantage of that research, and that is also driving what they expect in new voting technology. And I would also note that from our perspective, we see more and more buyers in states that I would characterize as increasingly savvy. They're doing a good job of sharing a lot of information with each other, and all of those things have been very important in sort of shaping the demand side of things. We've already talked about some of the most important other innovations. Auditability, of course, I'm sure is going to come up a lot more. There's also been tremendous progress made in terms of human factors research and usability, and that's something that we also, that is reflected in the expectations that people have. It is undeniable that one of the other things that's really shaping the state of the state is, in many places, the lack of funding. Of course, we don't have a repeat of HAVA. We don't have a HAVA 2. And what we have observed is simply there's a very wide range of, I would say, readiness for procuring big new voting systems. We see everything from places that have been putting away money for years and years, specifically with the goal of doing that, and others that are driving the need for the new voting system, and then the question is, okay, how are we going to fund it? So there's a wide spectrum there. And the other thing that I think is also really important that shapes how people are thinking about technology and the general outlines of the marketplace are, whether it's in voting or not, everybody in this room has seen many, many examples, and we know just in the world, as the state of technology has advanced enormously, there's also lots and lots of instances where average people can see examples of where technology has gone awry. There are huge issues with data in the cloud, that sort of thing. I won't go on that. And I also think that it is consequential and it's shaping the discussion that in a broader political context, I think the level of polarization in the country, and I would just say broadly, I'm hearing my old political scientist in me sort of feeling this, that there is, I think it's fair to say, there is a more fragile level of trust in some of the most fundamental institutions of our democracy, whether it's thinking about the quality of information that's out there, or people's trust in government and so forth. So that's just sort of how I would characterize some of the high-level points of what I think has been shaping things for the past 10 years or so. But the response to that fundamentally, and this was what I mentioned earlier, I do think that there is a kind of pivot point, is all of that has led to a recognition that there is not only a possibility and a potential for, but a desire for true modernization. And so I think when people are looking at their second generation voting technology, they do have different sets of expectations. They are thinking a lot more about accessibility. They are thinking about all the ways that in the past it might have been that they're picturing a precinct voting system with one particular type of voting medium, and now they're thinking, well, I need to be ready for the next thing. What if I do need to move into early voting more in the future? Or what if by mail becomes less restricted, for example? So all of that is sort of forcing the level of technology and the providers to step up the game. What we are actually really excited about at Hart, and I mentioned that we have a second generation system now, that really was fundamentally the reason that we did an entirely all new system. So our newest system that's called Verity, as I mentioned, its first EAC certification was only in 2015. And it was written specifically to try to get our arms around the decade of research and all the issues and everything that I'm describing right now. We wanted to pay attention to all the stuff that was coming out of Caltech and MIT and the Brennan Center for Justice and ballot design, and obviously really robust discussions around auditability from the Election Verification Network and verified voting, and a lot. One of the things that I think is most promising and also most challenging about dealing with election technology is just how broad and diverse the set of stakeholders is. So with our new system, we wanted to do that and get our arms around that. I think that whether it's us or any other voting system, that wide diversity of stakeholders, it makes it challenging, but all the more important to try to focus on what do you really need a voting system to do. And what I've put up here, the 3 questions, is just one way, one formulation that Hart has taken very seriously, that we have sort of heard many versions of, whether it's from advocates, whether it's from the election administrators, whether it's from voters and so forth. Is the voting system easy to use? This is a major investment. Is it a system that's going to last a long time? And of course, critically, how do I know if it's working correctly? And those 3 questions, as it were, point to what we think are really the 3 most critical values in terms of the discussion around technology today: usability and versatility and integrity. I can certainly answer lots more questions. I don't want to go into all the details of some of the ways that we have tried to implement these sorts of things in our technology, but just a few examples. Starting with an entirely new system from the very beginning, and since it does include an entire suite of software on the one hand, many separate applications that nevertheless operate as a family of applications, or as you can see at the bottom, we have one common hardware platform that can support lots of different types of voting. If people want to use traditional paper ballots, we can do that. If people want to print ballots on demand, we can do that. If people want to do electronic voting, they can do that. All of it very much a kind of universal design standpoint. But at the same time that we're thinking about that, and even as you are trying to design something sort of very comprehensive from the ground up, I think one of the things that's most important to understand about election technology in the US, because we don't have a national system of elections, as it were, is Tip O'Neill's famous dictum: all politics is local. And this is not, we do not have one national market for voting technology in the United States. We have 50 markets, and every state has its own expectations. They have their own political culture, which can be very, very different from one place to another. What one place is comfortable with is something that would be anathema in another state. There are very specific state laws, there's administrative rules, there are multiple layers of complexity that are defining all the requirements that the system has to do in all these multiple overlapping ways. And that's something that when you do the system design and when you think about flexibility, you need to pay very close attention to that. At the same time that ideally, technology should be able to have one system that can run almost any kind of an election. And the last one that I think has been obviously a source of tremendous focus, I'll just broadly say the topic of integrity, and in there I'm actually lumping two related but distinct things: security and auditability, transparency, and so forth. So having the opportunity to do a new system for Hart has been a good opportunity to employ the newest best practice in terms of technology, different kinds of things, the way that we thought about using digital signatures to end up with a transparent system where you can still have human readable cast vote records that are really easy to get to, but that are nevertheless very, very difficult to tamper with. Those are just some examples. And all the different ways of performing audits. There's obviously a lot of focus on the method of risk limiting audits in particular, but there are other ways of doing it. And again, trying to design a flexible system that can deliver those assets to the end users in a way that's understandable and easy. Those are the kinds of things that we had to pay very close attention to. So I would just sum up this by saying that if there is that turning point, at a very broad level, these are the most important values that we're focusing on. Certification, as I've already alluded to, is very, very complex. There is not only federal certification at the EAC level. Basically in the United States today, in the order of about 35 states, they rely on some use of the voluntary voting system guidelines or simply full EAC certification as a prerequisite to even starting with the word go at the state level of certification. And every state does require, with one or two exceptions, its own certification on top of a certification at the federal level can be anywhere from a month to 9 months or longer for a new system. State certifications can also easily last 6 months on top of that. So when I was talking about slow pace of change and long timelines, that gives you some of the flavor of that. We are comfortable in that space. The newest system has been through 4 federal EAC certifications. We think that the EAC is doing a very, very good job of managing a very, very complex program. And with something as important as voting, we think that the level of reassurance that provides is really, really critical. Having said that, the 3 issues that I put up on here that we can get into more is because it is so complicated, there are unintended consequences. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of very, very detailed and very technical standards for voting systems that if you're ever going to make even one slight change, it can really slow down the pace at which technology can be rolled out to the marketplace. And so I would, by way of introduction, say 3 of the things that we think are important, broadly speaking, when you're talking about certification is if there's ever a standard, if there's ever something into the program, ask yourself 3 questions, because these are the most critical ones. Is what you're proposing to do, will it increase the quality of the voting system? Number 1. The second one is it likely to help or hinder the healthy flow of technology to the marketplace? Because as technology keeps changing, a lot of it can actually help to increase access to voting and satisfaction with voting. And then the third one is, does it reduce or increase the costs, both fiscal and human, of running an election? Just 2 slides left. By way of challenges, the way I would sum it up is that the picture that I'm trying to paint of more possibilities due to technology, higher and better defined expectations due to a lot of research in the areas of usability, versatility, and transparency, coupled with a very complex certification regime, that's really adding to the complexity of the environment overall. And what that is doing is it is placing more and more demands on election administrators, and it's also making more complex for county commissioners and so forth, the people that are purchasing voting systems, to think about and understand their big investment. It also means that increasingly election administrators, many of whom have been there for decades and decades, they're passionate about elections and they know election law like the back of their hand, they're really having to become more and more expert in technology in a way that might not have initially been natural for them. And all of that puts more pressure on costs and ease of use. So I would say that for policymakers and technologists, it is no surprise that everybody wants usable and versatile and trusted voting systems. And what we hear about from our perspective as a manufacturer, from the buyers, is a lot of the things that I think are not, they don't rise to the surface as much in a forum like this. They have a lot of concerns around operating efficiency and what it's really like to use the system, cost, and so forth. And so getting our arms around all of those things is the challenge. In terms of Hart's recommendations, I would say from a policy standpoint, keep doing what you're doing. This sort of a forum and all of the efforts of the committee is precisely what is necessary to keep making this very critical issue more of a priority. Our perspective is that this picture of a woefully outdated and backwards almost, sort of state of technology I think currently that is more a challenge of priorities and politics and culture, and not only of technology. So driving on these things and making these topics more visible is critical. In certification, the scope of certification is really what it's all about. And so when I say certify only what's necessary, no more, no less, we want to try to avoid locking technology in one condition. And last but not least, in terms of collaboration, this sort of conversation is exactly what's necessary to learn about the full scope of all the variables that go into the technology. And it's, from our perspective, it's really all about trade-offs. All of those values, security, accessibility, voter service, cost, they are pushing and pulling on each other, and sometimes they are in conflict in ways that are not easy to resolve. And so, if nothing else, I hope we all leave today with a better appreciation for that complexity. I think one of the best ways, a recommendation, many of you probably do this already, and if you don't, go out and be a poll worker. It's one of the best ways, I think, to sort of really feel in a very immediate and concrete and visceral way the kinds of issues we're dealing with. And other than that, I would just say we're fundamentally optimistic, and I hope that you all will be too, because as I said, the change is real. So thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot.
And I will cede that to Mr. Coots.
Thank you very much. So McDermott, Coots, yes. Go ahead, and then we'll take all the questions from the committee at one time.
There might not actually be a whole lot I can add to the previous conversation, but I'm going to go ahead and give it my best shot. My name is McDermott Coots. Yes, McDermott is my first name. I do blame my parents for it. Really, nobody else I can. I'm the Director of Software Development for Unisyn Voting Solutions, so I'm one of the guys down in the trenches, and despite my president's best efforts, they have not been able to keep me from coding. So I'm still got my fingers on the keyboard, which is a great thing. So Unisyn Voting Solutions is a relatively newcomer to the environment of voting, which means we've only been around for about 10 years. The company itself has been around since 1972, where we did lottery systems. Very highly secure transactional systems. We thought that voting would be a natural extension of that. Yeah, no, that would not be the case. This is a very different business, a very different challenge. One thing that I would like to bring up, and it's fairly axiomatic, technology does not solve your problems. Technology can make your problems faster. And that is sometimes where we get a little bit wrapped around the axles. People keep saying, oh, I want the new thing, I want the new thing, I want the new thing. Well, why don't you take a look at your process? Now, there is plenty of technology that can help you work through a process and to change your process and to make things so that it does work better. And that's what we're trying to accomplish here. But technology, for the sake of technology, isn't going to fix anything. So, Unisyn Voting Solutions, just to bring it back around, we are in 12 states right now, 250 counties. We have had more federal certifications than I can shake a stick at this point, and states everywhere. Like most voting systems on the market today, we're a combination of an optical scan system, a little bit more traditional than what you're looking for. A piece of paper, you put marks on it, a lot of fun. And then also a ballot marking device, which is primarily focused on allowing accessibility, though it can be used by anybody. Now, this has come about, and this is why you see a lot of it out in the marketplace right now, because of this inherent conflict between security and accessibility. On their own, these voting systems are not really a security soft target. Well, ours aren't. Ever. They are part of a, actually no, not in the new system. So, we can. I'm looking forward to it. Notwithstanding, there is a lot of security built into it. Each machine has got its own key set, which it uses both to verify the election definition and to sign any of its outputs. All the keys are regenerated for every election. rigorous password policy. We have on the OCS system, which is a network occasionally, it has a FIPS level VPN system for all communications across the network.
What does OCS stand for?
Sorry, that's our central system, so that's the tabulation side of things. I'm sorry. We have a customized BIOS in the system for security. We also provide a lot of auditing capabilities. We have log files, we have analytics, we have risk limiting audits in our newly certified system. So a lot of things that are going on there that in order to help security, though again, it's kind of hard to target from a technology standpoint a standalone device sitting in a precinct. But in the wisdom, what we've come up with as sort of the compromise for security is paper. Paper is great. Paper is a valid capture of the voter's intent. And so when you have that piece of paper, you have something that's hard to change. You can't really change it too much without it being noticed. And when you scan it, then you can actually go back and through risk limiting audits or adjudication make changes based on how a human is interpreting what a voter is doing. There's problems with paper though. Paper is not accessible. If you're blind, you can't see it. If you have a physical disability, you can't touch it. And there's also the other portion of it, and this is kind of I think an urban legend from graduate school. There's the story of a large survey course, and the professor says, if you are late to the final, you will get a 0. Automatic F. Did you do this one? This might have been you.
No.
Okay. And so a student comes in late, fills out the final, not the first guy done, but he's coming up there. And the professor turns to him and says, well, I'm glad you came and took the final, but you get an F. And the student said to the professor, do you know who I am? The professor says, I have no idea who you are. Takes his final, shoves it into the stack of ballots, throws them all up in the air, and walks out the door. There is absolutely nothing that can be done at that state. At that point, you've got a final in there. Who are you going to disenfranchise? Who are you going to give that F to? You can't. So, again, paper is not perfect. But that's kind of the compromise we came up with. Now, accessibility, the ballot marking devices is how we address a lot of the accessibility issues. Our new touchscreen system has a lot of accessibility built in. We've got the basics. We have ability to adjust font, contrast, brightness. We have an audio ballot. We have a tactile keypad. We have a sip and puff interface. We actually have added in this one, which I'm actually very pleased with, a screen reader mode, which looks a lot like an iPhone for navigation through a ballot. Swipe right, swipe left, volume up, volume down, 2 fingers for tempo. I've seen blind voters go through this thing faster than I could go through a regular ballot. It's been great. But that's not where we need to be going. If you talk to people in the accessibility industry, what we need is to allow people to use their own assistive technology in all of its wondrous varieties and combinations. I'm a lucky one, and many of you around this table are also. I carry my assistive technology around with me everywhere I go, and it works for almost everything. I got my glasses. Everybody's got something. But for people who have more severe, that they can't carry that around, the Helen Keller Society, for example, they need the ability to interface with their own systems without violating the security of the system. They need to be able to plug their own stuff in. I don't know if any of you have ever seen or looked at a Braille keypad. They are complex, but they are very widely used. So, trying to go through the list of things that I was given as the talk about. And I think I've talked a little bit more about security, the auditability, about the accessibility of the system. But I think what we need to talk about, as I talked about earlier, is that there's no system that's perfect. None. We're dealing with humans. At the end of the day, we are dealing with a human at the end of the trust chain. We are dealing with humans who are voting. We have humans who have imperfect understanding of the system on something that they only use maybe 1 or 2 times a year. So where do we see the future of voting going? We see common data format. Common data format, well, some people are fighting against it. It's happening. Common data format is a thing that will allow systems to interact with each other. It will allow people to use their own assistive technologies in order to populate a ballot and then cast it. As we talked about earlier, I think risk limiting audits are a big thing coming down. Non-geographic voting through vote centers. And as Eddie also said, simplifying of the rules. We have 50 states. They all jealously guard their way of voting. There are 4, possibly more, different implementations of straight ticket voting in the United States. Each of them a slight variation on the other. And our systems have to handle all of that. So I suppose in retrospect, or what I would like to, and also the certification process. Certification process, as Eddie said, is very complex. You go through the federal certification, then you have to go to the states. It takes a long time to get through the state. If you've got a security problem that you need to address, not through any fault of our own, we've got the Hart lead on Linux that needs update. How do we get that through the federal certification and then all the states and get that out there in a reasonable time frame for use in election when the systems are almost constantly in use? So we need to have a simplification of that process, a way to speed it up, and hopefully make a better system. I realize I was not nearly as coherent as Mr. Perez on this, a little bit more stream of consciousness, and maybe I am the James Joyce of voting, but probably not.
All right, we're ready. We'll try to bring whatever questions the committee has. Nate?
So, Fred, we've been focusing a lot on consequences of changes in voting technology and security post-2016 election. And thinking about security, as you know, some of the voting system manufacturers were penetrated by Russian efforts in the last election. What changes have you sort of thought about as a company with respect to specifically that new threat in the last year, and other sort of recommendations we should be thinking about?
That's a good question, Nate. I think the easiest way I would sum it up is, one, both for designers of the technology like Hart, and I would say for anybody that has a stake in the administration election, it highlights that you do have relationships among a lot of distinct subsystems. So one thing I actually want to put a finer point on, and this is important, this goes to the point that Josh was making, is the fundamental question of where is there or is there not connectivity, for example. So one thing that's really important and that people have clarified, you need to be very clear in your distinction between where do you have data in something like a voter registration system that is connected, it is living in the cloud in some place. Where do you have normal kinds of other, just let's call it a general office environment in the election administration world? And then also within all of that nexus, where is the voting system itself, and what, if anything, is the relationship between the voting system and all the rest? Now, what I would say, what it has done for Hart, and I want to be very clear, Hart makes voting systems. We create the umbrella that includes the election management software to create and define the ballot, all the ballot styles, the election, to deploy that on individual voting devices, and then to gather all of the recorded, captured cast vote records and tabulate it. That's the sum total of what we do, and I would say, if anything, the recent events have heightened the importance of really treating that like a walled garden, because everything about the software and the hardware and the way that it needs to be stored, the level of access that different types of staff have to it, what you're going to ask of their background, what does your warehouse look like, what is literally the method by which, for example, you are transferring your election definition from your computer, which is hopefully a closed computer on a closed network that's not connected to anything else. How are you getting that election definition to the individual devices? There were older systems, not that Hart made, but I'll give you an example. I mean, and this is also a very vivid example of how different the world of the people that are on the ground, the way they think about elections versus some of these discussions. I will never forget an instance where we were talking to a jurisdiction that wanted to buy new technology, and they asked, how do you get your election definition from the computer that made it to the devices? And we said, well, all of that goes through an air gap. Okay, we use a secure media that goes from the computer to each individual device, and that's how you have to load it. Oh, they were instantly just shaking their heads, and they were horrified, because they're like, that's going to take so long. We're used to using wireless to do all of that. You know, and we were sort of like, well, that's not the way we think about it. So I think the best way I would sum it up, Nate, is one, for Hart, we want to continue doing what we do best, which is voting systems, no more, no less. It is a very contained sort of design set, as it were. I would say more broadly, I think what it does for us, because we also provide a lot of services to our customers that use our voting systems, is we are trying to provide them support and a level of education to think about just all the kinds of wider connections that we're talking about. And so even if there are good controls that can be imposed on the voting system itself, Travis County is actually an excellent example. At our user groups, they presented procedural methods for doing a security audit in their jurisdiction. Literally, think about all the places you could have risk, think about how to mitigate them. We made a list of, this is our warehouse, this is our transportation, these are individual polling places. And so that's the other thing we can try to do, is in addition to that, a level of support.
This is a really important discussion. I want to ask a question to Nate. Do you want to follow up on that at all?
Well, maybe I'll leave you to follow up on it, but I wanted sort of more concrete, partly because we're writing a report on this. Like, is there a thing that you've done since November 2016, a recommendation that was made to your employees, changes in email practices, changes in
Yes.
that would be useful to know sort of concrete.
And I would add, are these things or risks that you cannot grapple with on your own? Do you need the assistance of the federal government and the capacities they have in order to assess the risk and do something about it?
I would say, and I'll try to be more brief than I was in my last answer, to the extent that if the lesson is the security and the risk is multi-layered, it goes from VR to procedures to the voting system itself. Department of Homeland Security has cybersecurity alerts and all that sort of thing. To the extent that we are one component of a much wider connected system, yes, it has, the other thing that it has made us to think about is the scope of that. You mentioned, for example, important things like phishing and other types of hacks that can be delivered. Just in terms of your own corporate IT environment, yes, those are things that we ended up writing up our own internal policies about, disseminating those throughout Hart. It has caused us to take a closer look at our own practices and everything else. And I think that in general, it raises the level. What I kind of like is when DHS talks about things like cybersecurity hygiene, that speaks to just the scope of what you're talking about there, and we've tried to highlight here.
Do you want to answer that?
I would actually. At Unisyn, we've actually taken some concrete steps. We have actually just 2 weeks ago received our ISO 27001 certification for security, which is a very comprehensive security policy. Now, luckily, we were doing almost everything already, but there, as Eddie alluded to, there's a lot of hygiene, a lot of training, a lot of things. Hey, think about it. If you find a USB sitting in the parking lot, don't stick it in your computer. Give it to IT. Let them check it out. Then you can make. Then we can find the actual owner. Things on training on emails. These sorts of things, just across the board, from everybody, from the people who are answering the phones to the people coding the system.
Andrew?
I'd like to ask each of you, so in what ways your equipment sort of supports new styles of auditing, such as ballot comparison, risk limiting audits. Now, on Mr. Perez's slide, I noticed one line about traceability from the cast vote record to the individual piece of paper, and maybe you could address that as well, Mr. Coots. But also, how efficient is it to find that piece of paper, and how does that interact with sort of the secret ballot and so on? So, and on the same topic of audits, audits itself could be a service, but it might be one that one would like to see a different company do than the vendor of the equipment itself, right? So, what are the ways in which that could work?
Do you want to start with?
I can't. I mean, one of the key features in order to get where you're going with having separate companies do the audits is the common data format. The moment we can have a common data format, then everything becomes opened up. People can check, is this the way things are counted? Should they have been counted this way? But because we need to have a common language that we can speak. I mean, other than just rescanning all of the ballots.
But in the meantime, are the
In the
data
meantime,
formats you use for your cast vote records and so on sort of accessible enough in this way?
we actually have an entire module we call Auditor, and it provides the ability to view the electronic scan of the ballot against the electronic record of the ballot. There are enhancements to that basic functionality. One of them is a risk limiting audit, which is part of our newly certified system. The risk limiting audit allows you to compare the cast vote record against the image and say, did these match? Did the machine count it correctly? Yes or no? And at that point, you can make a determination. We also allow adjudication through that and write-in assessment.
Okay, but what about comparing the image to the actual piece of paper?
There's that issue with anonymization. How do you keep
So how does your equipment support, efficiently finding the right piece of paper and comparing it with?
Not efficiently.
Okay. So is that something that you have in a development process to sort of research and development? How you can?
We are looking for that answer. Basically, how do you not uniquely identify the ballot while uniquely identifying the ballot is ultimately what it comes down to.
The same questions for you.
Sure. Thanks, and it's a great question. I'll do it in two parts. Let me tell you how we sort of almost philosophically kind of approach the question of audits, and I'll tell you about the specific features. I would say from a design standpoint and the way that we think about what is it that we need to do with audits is a modern voting system, we think, one, it's commonplace that easy auditing needs to be a core competency. That to have features to support that needs to be the core competency of any modern voting system. So we take seriously that we think audits need to be usable. That's one thing. The second thing is we also want to design a system that's going to allow the flexible application of different kinds of audit methods. One example that I think is easy for a lot of people to understand is at a very high level, if you say, you need to be able to do a recount with a voting system, not the same thing, but it's just an example. Everybody understands at some level what a recount is, but it's also true that, as I said before, 50 different markets, 50 different states, every state thinks about the specific implementation of how to do their recount a little bit differently. And so we're assuming that we need to be thinking about audits in the same way. I mentioned earlier that START method is increasingly popular, very well developed. We're checking all the boxes there, which I'll talk about features in a moment, but people might do other things. They might do a fixed percentage audit and so forth. And so with all of that as background, and with the further assumption that no, a voting system can't audit itself and shouldn't audit itself. That's the whole point of an audit. You don't want to design anything where you are effectively relying on something that people can perceive as the fox in the hen house. And so from a design standpoint, what we think with the goals that I just said, what you need to be able to do then is, in a usable and efficient way, you need to be able to easily provide the assets to the end users and to a wide group of stakeholders, advocates, auditors, election people, and so forth, precisely the kinds of things that you're talking about, which I'll get into. How easy is it to find the ballot image? And is your CVR easily understandable or not? Can I easily export it in a format that third parties can work with it, so you can say, take it, look at it. You don't need my system at all. That's the whole point of software independence. And so what we do is we provided features to do that, and we think that it is our job to educate our end users on how to use those features. The actual method and implementation of any particular audit is usually coming from outside the system, as it should, and then you can apply it. So, very briefly, the particular features and implementations, we do of course have options, as I mentioned, where we have paper. Our cast vote records in the system are human readable. They're written in an XML format, and we digitally sign them with FIPS compliant methods and things from NIST, and they comply with VBSG. But we took seriously, when we were thinking about security and everything else, that we wanted to have a transparent system. We did not want to have CVRs or anything else that looked like a black box. So our CVRs are human readable, and they have identifiers that allow us to trace them back to either individual images of the ballot, and cross-reference with GUIDs and so forth, and the individual images of the ballot. Now, the part that's relatively easy is if you're using a scanner for by mail, for example. If you have batches in that way, it's pretty straightforward in a way that is both efficient and that provides privacy and anonymity to say this particular image corresponds to physical ballot that was sequence number 8 in the 3rd batch. And you can go find that stack of paper and flip through and find the 8th image and say, yeah, that's the same one, and here's my physical ballot. It is a little more complicated when you have a precinct scanner. We can trace the CVR and the images and the physical asset to that particular ballot receptacle. We are working on the easy, most efficient way to save people from having to sort through a lot of individual ballots in a box, but we can at least get to that particular polling place or that location and so forth. And
when you say you're working on, is something that one might expect to see in, as an add-on to your 2015 product within a couple of years?
yes, we have, we're working on additional releases since the 15 initial baseline, and we have a roadmap right now that will have releases this year, next year, and so forth.
And
so
are we
it's
talking
something that
about
we're looking
sort of
at.
getting to an identifiable sequence number in a precinct count ballot batch, or?
In my ideal world, the part that we have solved is I can have a paper record that you can uniquely identify in a way that preserves the privacy and the anonymity of the voter. I can also save an actual ping image that you could share with other people. I can save an image of that ballot. It's literally a snapshot. I can see, okay, it's getting a correct snapshot, as it were, because we have a digital system. And I can also correlate those two things with the electronic cast vote record that is human readable, and you can say the way the counts that I can see in both the image and the physical asset, they do actually match. So we can do that, and then the question of shuffling through paper, that's the part we're working on. The last thing I'd like to add that I think is really important when I talk about flexibility and auditing and so forth, and making it easy to efficiently allow people to work with cast vote records and images and so forth, is one thing that's pretty unique about our system is in our tabulation and reporting system, once all the cast vote records end up there, we have a really, really long, robust list of filters which the user can define, so they can basically self-select what is the important audit unit that I care about. Do I care about a particular batch? Do I care about a particular race? Do I care about a particular polling place location? And instead of, having a really difficult situation where you might have an enormous universe of all these cast vote records, they can efficiently and discreetly say, that's what I'm interested in exporting, and that can be exported, as I said, in an XML format that third parties can work with at that level. I hope that answers some of your questions.
Actually, some of my questions. I'll be able to.
Thank you.
not here, so I, for one, appreciate your appearance.
We're happy to be here.
Take my personal.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have two quick questions. More for Eddie, just because I'm more familiar with Hart, but McDermott, feel free to chime in. So there's been a lot of discussion about open source systems, and you made a conscious choice, Hart, to not go that direction. Although there are, I think, some really good models out there for open source service-based models where you can actually make money doing that. What is the thought process behind not doing that?
So it's a great question, and it's an important question. Let me try to answer it. My core knowledge, and the best way I can answer it, is by lining up what I think are the needs of the current certification regime as against an open source kind of model, and what are some of the complexities that might be there. I don't profess to have a directional answer to all of that. I think there's people in this room far wiser than me on the very complex issue of open source, but I'll say this. So I think what's important for everybody to understand is, as I mentioned, somewhere on the order of 35 out of the 50 states require EAC certification before you can bring voting technology to their state and enter their specific state certification process. Probably the most important and defining thing at the level of configuration management with the EAC is that when you take a system, every single thing about the particular configuration that you are taking is locked or frozen at that moment, as it were. It's almost like the dragonfly in amber. And what I mean by that is at the level of what major and minor version of software, have you made any modifications here? What is the third-party commercial off-the-shelf software that you may have also incorporated into here and that you have to disclose, and what version of that? And what is the level of the drivers that you're using on that commercial Canon scanner, and which hardware revision do you have? You get the picture. At an extremely granular level, almost down to every last thing, whether it's in a bill of materials, whether it's in a line of code, whether anything you can trace to that sort of version, that is what the EAC, well, that's what you need to disclose, and it is transparently disclosed. I mean, we have very, very exhaustive technical data packages that need to go to the EAC. It's a very open inspection process. You need to give them all the source code. You need to provide examples of every single, component to be tested and so forth. And where I'm going with this, Neil, is simply to say that based on my understanding of open source, one of the things that I think is most appealing and exciting to people is the possibility to potentially make modifications in a more agile way. You've got a community of people that are all interested, that they all want what's best for the technology, and they're all collaborating with each other, and you can have these sort of 1,000 points of light. 1,000 points of light kind of vision and the way that certification is working today is not a neat fit. So that's sort of the best answer I can give there. And the second thing I would simply say is, one of the other things that Hart thinks about is, and I think it's fair to say that if you just sort of read about open source generally, the phrase can mean different things to different people. And so you need to be very, very specific about, well, what is the particular interest you have in open source? Are you talking about a particular way of thinking about intellectual property? Are you talking about the cost? Are you talking about a certain level of transparency? And so forth. And in our experience at Hart, so I'll say one, open source from our buyers does not, I'll just be candid, it does not come up very often. To the extent that it does, I think it's usually coming from an impulse that has to do more with transparency. Sort of like, how do I know you're not hiding anything in the software? And the answer to that is what I just told you. Well, there's this very rigorous process. It's going to a completely independent EAC accredited lab. They have to be accredited through the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We're not delivering, that's another thing too, all of the testing that happens for any federal campaign, we literally don't provide the software. We provide the source code, and it is actually the test lab that compiles all of that into the actual executable system that they're doing. And so I think the proxy for that concern around how do I know that you're not hiding anything and how can I have confidence in the integrity of the system, what the EAC is doing for those 35 plus states is their answer to that need. And that's pretty much how, that's the state of the state on this issue that we've observed.
Just a quick thought, sir. you also made a conscious choice in your new system to have it closed in terms of the design, right? So you don't have separate screens, you don't have separate printers. Unforeseen security issues, like to Nate's point earlier, you know, if I wanted to patch a system, I can't really do that with your closed loop system.
Well, I would say this. So, and again, I'm channeling the wisdom of Hart's VP of Engineering. I've made it clear I'm more on sort of the end user side, and I'm not an engineer myself, but I do understand enough. One of the things that's really important is having a closed system really cuts both ways. Because on the one hand, there are certain ways and places that closed can equal less flexible. But on the other hand, another way of thinking about it sometimes is closed can provide more control, and it can also provide more consistency. And I'll give you just one example. When we do have that closed system, so for example, when we install our software on the PC workstations that it runs on, we install it in what's known as a kiosk environment. The easiest example is, think when you go to the airport and you need to get your boarding pass on one of those machines. That machine does one and only one thing. Not without a little work, if I'm a traveler at the airport, I can't walk up and start getting to the Windows desktop on that boarding pass kiosk and doing a bunch of other things. And so we implement things on our workstations and on our devices in the same way. And what's important is at the level of the operating system, we're using an embedded form of the operating system where we are actually only building and installing the components of the system that we need, the applications and the drivers and the things and so forth, and anything that is not needed for our voting system or that we think poses a security risk for the voting system is not part of that environment. And for the same reason, we can then continue to evaluate what is the meaning of a patch that might be out in the world to us. If there are patches coming out from Microsoft about Internet Explorer, well, guess what? We never even put that in our operating system, so it doesn't apply to us. So I would just say it cuts both ways there.
So I was going to follow up on that, and then I thought you clarified it, and I'm confused again.
Okay.
You asserted that in the certification process, every component is specified in the version and all of that, and now
Correct.
you just talked about patches.
So let me clarify that. So first of all, actually the shortest way to clear that up is the top of the patches comes up because that's a question that we get a lot. The fact of the matter is, for the way we have implemented our system, it is very rare that we need to think about effectively doing what a patch does. We have the ability to do it. It would be from one release to another. So for any configuration that is going through certification at a moment in time, again, think of it as a snapshot. This is the system I'm taking at that moment. We have built it up in the way I described at that component level, and that is the configuration that is being certified. Let's suppose it gets federally and state certified, and it gets pushed out into the world. At the same time that that is out in the world, as new information about security vulnerabilities and so forth are coming out, we are constantly assessing that new information against the fielded system. And we're needing to ask ourselves the question, is that new threat relevant to the particular way we have done things or not? If it is, and if we do effectively need to do a patch, then the way things work at both the federal and most state levels is, well then, yes, we are modifying the configuration of that system, and you would need to repeat the process of doing that traceability and what exactly are the versions and components you're doing, and then you need to repeat the certification process for that modification, irrespective of whether it was small or large. And that's a good example of why I was saying that it can really increase. There's strong disincentives to making changes all of the time in this technology in the way that so many people are used to in the consumer electronic space. And because you have to keep doing this iterative, time-consuming, very monetarily expensive process. I hope that clears that up.
That helps a lot, but now
Okay.
I don't understand your argument against open source, because you do have a change process, and you are making changes, and I don't see why open source.
They are not quick, though. We're talking,
I
to
know
get
they're
through
not.
federal and state, we're probably talking a year.
I know that, but that's independent of whether it's open source or not.
This is true. I mean, one of the perfect examples of this is currently the state of Georgia, which is trying to make machines that are still running Windows 2000, I believe. And they have to actually custom build these in order to support that operating system because they can't change it. The people who build it aren't there anymore.
So let's go to Josh, then Charles, then back to Henry.
Okay. So I have a question for each of you. I think these are both important questions, but I hope they can be quick. So,
I don't know, Eddie.
I heard
Maybe
you.
quit.
listen. Okay, so first, Eddie, what you said sounds really good. But we've heard from election officials and others a great deal of frustration about lack of security, lack of innovation, lack of transparency, lack of responsiveness. So specifically, in your own jurisdiction, election officials developed a system with much more innovation, much better security, much better transparency, verifiability, ultimately lower cost, and asked vendors to build it. Why are you not building it?
Well, so with full respect to the Starbuck project, which of course it is in our home, we watched it very closely. We absolutely think that it was an innovative project. We bid on that project as well. There were components of that RFP that we thought that we could contribute to, and we do want to be part of that. I guess the short answer I'll give you, Josh, is twofold. Number one is, with full respect to the design decisions and the particular implementation that were envisioned for that, we would actually say that at the same time, and that was a many years project from about 2011 until now, that was exactly the same time that our limited resources, and we're not a huge company, and money is not infinite either, we were engaged on building a completely new system that is only a couple years old, that I would say in a really respectful way, I would love nothing more than for people to, no, you don't have to take my word for it here today, but learn about it, learn about Verity. I mean, all of the things, you're right, that the complaints that people have are real, and they are out there. That's why we said we don't want to keep iterating on first generation design thinking. We want to start with a clean slate and make a completely new system. And to our knowledge, we're the only manufacturer that has not only done that, but has taken it through federal certification multiple times, because that level of maturity and you have to prove it is important. I hope that answers your question. In part.
Well, not the only company, actually. Because I have heard exactly what you're hearing. And I have heard from counties that I go in to talk to and say, yes, I bought this system and I buy the software maintenance agreement and I never got an update. Never updated anything. I've heard that. I absolutely have. This is not the case with Unisyn. We have actually had a release, I think, every year since we started. We are constantly listening to our customers. We did also bid on the Starvo project. We are also currently bidding on Dean Logan's project in Los Angeles. Though I might have to take some exception on cheaper. That may not necessarily be the case.
Ultimately, because of the equipment
So, and we are listening to everybody. One of the things that I'm a scoutmaster, and we teach public speaking as a merit badge, believe it or not. And one of the things we don't teach, however, or we do teach, but it's not a merit badge, is listening. And that is actually the more important skill. So, yes, we are listening. The problem is that the time frame between hearing it and somebody seeing it, in many cases, the time frame is so long that they've forgotten they said it.
So I have an entirely different question for you.
Okay.
So I applaud what you're doing to support voters with disabilities. And certainly not all voters with disabilities have problems with paper, but some certainly do.
Yes.
So the concern, of course, with the paperless system is how do you verify that your vote has been counted properly? And the EAC has put forward a compromise that's likely to be in the next BBSG that says if you build a paperless system, it has to be end-to-end verifiable. how do you feel about that? Is that something that you are willing to do to support the,
Absolutely.
voters?
And actually, it's kind of interesting that you bring this up, because the first system I built, which, believe it or not, was actually the one for Los Angeles that they're using now, which they hired us to build to spec. We built it exactly the way they asked us to. But there were a couple of additional things. And one of the things we actually had in there was the ability on the stub to print out a transaction ID on the stub that the voter could take away. And there was actually a system on the back end where somebody could log in with their transaction ID and see that their ballot was counted in that race. It won't tell you that who they voted for, just that the ballot was counted in a specific race. Nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted to use it. It just seemed like again, it came down to, it's so hard. It's so much extra work. We've got enough going on. We've got 5 elections a year, maybe more if we have a special. And we've got basically this one break in July where we go to a conference. So
If that's part of the requirements, and there's actually a suit going on now saying that that jurisdictions must support disabled voters and must provide a paperless option, and that if that paperless option to be certified has to be end-to-end verifiable, is that something you support? Is that something you're
it is something I absolutely support. It is something I'm actually quite looking forward to, because I actually am an engineer and I'm looking forward to the challenge.
Yep.
And I would also say, Josh, that is something that Hart would also welcome, kind of echo what Dermot said. As we have followed the different visions and different implementations of end-to-end verifiability, I think the one thing that we have sometimes had discomfort with, and we think would be very important in any system, is make it usable. Usability is really important. I think that, you know, trust is a lot harder when people cannot really understand what's being explained to them if it's overly complex. And given that verifiability does go to such a wide group of stakeholders, that's, I think, a really important value as part of the design exercise.
The education is a very important component. Just a simple example, ranked choice voting. It's a great idea. Our system is actually certified to support it. But every time a election official looks at it, they say, how do I explain this to the voters? How do I explain that their guy went from here to here, or went from here all the way to the bottom or gone?
I live near Tacoma, Washington, where they tried it for one cycle with a lot of push and advertising and ran away from it screaming as quickly as they could.
All right, we have
Thank
about,
you. I appreciate those.
we have about 10 minutes. We want to make sure that everybody gets in. Charles, then Andrew again.
So, really quick, well, first of all, to editorialize, as someone from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has been doing ranked choice voting for 70 years, and everyone loves it, for the games that you can play with it. It is explainable and it can be part of civic culture. It has other problems. The question I wanted to ask actually came back to the questions that Nate and Lee were asking early on, and it has to do not so much, it's more about manufacturing practices. So as I've been talking to people in kind of the cyber security world as they get into voting, almost to a person they seem alarmed, that they are alarmed at what they are viewing as the sourcing of critical components in election systems from afar. And I sense a movement into requiring that American voting systems be entirely sourced domestically and that there be other controls in the manufacturing process. What are your thoughts about that? What difference would that make? Yeah, so just what are your thoughts about that in terms of both business at the industry as a whole and their own?
Yeah. Good question, Charles. I would say, one, in general, I think it's a completely reasonable impulse. It's a good question to be asking. I think that if that decision, if that were a policy that wanted to be made, do I think that's a crazy policy? No. What I do think is, like anything else, and again, the picture I've tried to paint, that lever of cost is one of lots of different things that people care about. I think whether we like it or not, and even when we accept the vulnerabilities that come with a global capitalist economy, it's a reality. The economics and the sourcing parts and everything else, I think anybody that's in technology, and even in the DEF CON report, I mean, they themselves acknowledged, look, a lot of high computing things, not just in voting, but generally, a lot of it is sourced from foreign places. So I would say that today, the way we deal with it was sort of my answer to Neil. It is a open and disclosed and thoroughly tested sort of process. And if changes to that needed to be made in the future, we would deal with it. Because that's, I mean, Hart has always taken very seriously, we want to make systems that we can actually get certified and that we can do so, you know, everybody with eyes wide open needs to accept the trade-offs and so forth, but if we feel like we are getting more value out of it with a new set of policies, then that's what we want to test and design to, and we will deliver that.
Well, I agree. I mean, again, if this is what the requirements are, we'll make that work. But there's going to be a very, very significant cost. And the voting industry is not actually huge. I mean, even if you replaced every single voting machine in the country, you'd still be less than the number of iPhones that were created. We really don't have enough throughput to really make a difference in any sort of cost structure. Even if every single one of us was getting together and trying to work a deal with the manufacturer. So there's going to be a big cost to some people who really can't support it. And that's kind of that would be a concern. But again, if it becomes a significant concern, if we need to say we can only buy from here or this is where it is, we'll make that work.
So I understand that you do whatever you need to do to sell a product. I mean, have you always
please.
like sharpened your pencils and tried to figure out kind of orders of magnitude about what domestic sourcing versus foreign sourcing would be?
In some cases, we can't find it. In some cases, we're looking around trying to find something that matches what we've got right now, and it's not there, so we'd almost have to go and get it custom built.
What's an example?
Well, actually, I mean, a lot of stuff we do have sourced here. Our keypads are all manufactured here, but things like motherboards, the chips, you know, some of these things we get from from Taiwan. And that's a much better cost that we get to pass on.
Okay, Andrew.
Mr. Coots, you said something about simplification of the regulatory environment. Number one, sort of harmonizing of state laws regarding, you know, how to count votes, and number two, in the certification process. Are there any written documents or written proposals saying exactly, you know, what kinds of simplifications would be reasonable and desirable, let's say from the vendor's point of view, or anything like that we could study?
Well, there was a document that was being worked on by the EAC. Jessica Meyer specifically was working on it, and I think many of you know who she is. And this was basically a listing of, these are all the individual state requirements, and that's the first step. I mean, and unfortunately, in some cases, the states are not quite sure of the interpretation of those laws. I've had a couple of instances where I've gone into a certification and they say, wow, the way you did that really makes a whole lot more sense. But that's not the way we think the law is written. Well, shoot. Okay, well, back around. So, so the first step is to get that document.
That may exist or may not have been completed, and it was about state regulations. Were you making any specific proposals about the EAC certification process, or has that evolved to a place where the vendors can live with it now?
Now this is an interesting one because I actually sit on the TGDC as well, which is working on the new set of standards, and I think that structure will work for us very well to remove a lot of the ambiguity of the system by using test assertions as part of the definition. Basically removing the ambiguity. You must do this. Okay, well, okay, then we can do that. But again, a lot of it comes down to the fact that the VVSG is the lowest common denominator. These are the basic things you need to do. It's when you get into the states that you see some very complex things that may not be completely good. And they're not necessarily in law. They may be in administrative rules. They may be all sorts of places.
So just to clarify or to dovetail a little bit on what McDermott said, And our perspective's a little different. I think the obstacles are very real from state to state. What he was describing was immediately the first thing that I thought of as well. Essentially what the EAC was trying to do, rather than think of it as sort of a leveling of requirements, this is not an effort of, hey, let's change our thinking and come up with something new so we can all get along. This was instead an attempt to put together a testing matrix that would more comprehensively, at the front end, allow the EAC to get its arms around as many requirements, even if they weren't, during the federal testing process, that even if they weren't required for federal law per se, or VVSG, it might be useful to some of these other states. And so the intent there was, well, if you've already tested it during the EAC process, you just saved yourself some time. To McDermott's point, I think there's enough distance between the examiners that stand on the ground at any specific state and their interpretation of those laws, and seeing a piece of paper that has a check from the EAC that says conforms with Michigan, straight party, for example. And that really leads to the second thing.
You say there's enough distance. I didn't quite get what you meant by that.
Well, I guess what I mean is, it is one thing to, let's suppose that you are an examiner for the state of Michigan, and it is your job that you have your list of all of the things that are in law or administrative rule that any voting system must conform with. And on the one hand, you might be handed a piece of paper or an EAC report that has a checkbox that says conforms. Based on our experience at Hart, I'm not sure that the intent of having, oh, we've already tested for it, is in fact going to save at that moment, because I think the examiners are typically like, well, we really need to see that, and I want to see it with my own eyes. And to McDermott's excellent point, lots of this stuff, the interpretation of what's either in administrative rule or law, lots of times it's definitely more art than science. And what one person says is going to be a little different than the other. So while I think that that is a good idea as a testing effort, I think it's only as good as far as it goes. And I would echo that, the federal and state structure that the United States has right now, and I liked your word, the jealousy with which different states are protective of their particular idiosyncrasies and cultures and everything else, is very, very strong. And I think those are real obstacles to leveling anything too much.
Can I just jump in for 10 seconds here? This is just a follow-up. Can you guys, maybe after this meeting, just email us a concrete example where that particular phenomenon has happened, where you end up with sort of this cumbersome state repeat of EAC certification for a particular part or change? You don't have to answer now, but it might be useful because that's the kind of thing in the report that we could.
Yeah, I'd be happy.
Last question from Ron.
This is motivated by something you raised, Eddie, but hopefully you can answer it, and it relates to the question you raised as to will it last? The life cycle planning for voting systems is interesting, and we're sort of seeing now everybody's ready to replace their systems and so on too. And primarily it's been a purchase model. Are you seeing much interest in or use of the other models such as leasing for voting systems or other ways that people can, institutions can sort of have a different life cycle planning structure?
The short answer is, in our experience, it comes up sometimes, Ron. We don't see it a lot. Most people, it is a purchase model, and I think part of the reason that I would say, people like Neil or Dana could speak to this better than I could, but I think that what we do hear from a lot of jurisdictions is they feel most reassured and they feel most efficient when they really can fully take ownership of all of the ins and outs of a particular voting system. And when I say ownership, I mean it literally and figuratively, and truly do the robust work of incorporating all of their own local procedures, their own interpretation of the law, and the way they're going to implement all of that with a consistent system that they can then have that certainty and consistency over a long period of time. I think that has value to a lot of the people. That's what we see.
I would echo that. We do have some leasing going on, but ultimately, a lot of what it comes down to is it takes a few years for them to actually get their processes really integrated with a new system. You walk into a new county and they're like, this is the way we've always done it. Okay, well let's work with this. And so it takes a couple of years, and eventually they say, yeah, this is great. Now you're changing it on me again. Voting doesn't move fast. We're still voting on paper.
on behalf of the committee, we really thank you very, very much for coming. And we want to say that you both have earned a merit badge in public speaking.
Thank you, Mr. Bolger, and thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. This was our pleasure.
Thanks for being so frank.
I might get in trouble for it.
That is.
All right, so we'll take 5 minutes while we pick up.